Your father built roads, Conrad. Roads. You think that makes him qualified to give business advice? My son-in-law said that at Thanksgiving dinner, loud enough that my daughter Iris stopped mid-reach for the cranberry sauce. Loud enough that my grandson in the next room went quiet. Loud enough that the word roads hung in the air like something he'd scraped off his shoe. I had just suggested, quietly, that their new restaurant's location might be a problem. That the foot traffic numbers on that block had been declining for 3 years. That I'd seen it with my own eyes driving past. That was all I said. My name is Conrad Marsh. I'm 67 years old, and I spent 34 years as a civil engineer for the Oregon Department of Transportation. I have designed load calculations for overpasses that are still standing after earthquakes. I have sat in rooms with governors and federal inspectors and argued successfully about structural tolerances. I have never, not once, introduced myself that way at a family dinner. I've always just been Iris's dad, the quiet one who brought good wine and asked about the grandkids. The man who said roads like it was an insult is named Preston Hale. He came into my daughter's life 6 years ago with a salesman's confidence and a LinkedIn profile that described him as a visionary entrepreneur. He had opened 2 restaurants before he met Iris, both of which had closed within 18 months. He described those failures as pivots and strategic redirections in a tone that suggested they were accomplishments. And Iris, my smart, careful, funny daughter Iris, had looked at him across a bar one night and apparently decided that the confidence was the substance. I tried to like Preston. I want to say that plainly. I tried for years. But the Thanksgiving comment was not the first comment. It wasn't even the 10th. It was just the one that happened to land in front of my 6-year-old grandson Oliver, who looked up from the kids' table in the doorway with those big curious eyes, trying to understand why the room had gone so still. I looked at Iris. She was looking at her plate, the same way she had every other time. I put my napkin beside my plate, pushed back my chair without scraping it, and excused myself to the bathroom. I stood in front of the mirror in the hallway bathroom, the one Iris had redecorated with little ceramic fish tiles I'd helped her pick out at a market in Cannon Beach, and I looked at myself for a long moment. I was not angry. That surprised me. I expected to be angry. What I felt instead was something quieter and much more permanent. The recognition that I had been patient long enough to mistake my patience for a solution. And it wasn't one. It had never been one. I washed my hands, dried them on the hand towel, and went back to the table. I ate the rest of my meal and I listened to Preston talk about his plans for a second location. I asked Oliver about his soccer team. I helped carry dishes to the kitchen. And on the drive home, in the dark, with the highway stretching out ahead of me in the rain, I made a decision. Let me back up, because without the context, none of what comes next makes any sense, and the context matters more than the ending. 3 years ago, Preston came to me with a business plan. He wanted to open a farm-to-table restaurant in southeast Portland, a nicer neighborhood than his previous attempts. And he needed an investor. He had some local backing, he said, but not enough. He needed someone who believed in the vision. I asked to see the financials. He handed me 11 pages of projections that had been formatted to look more detailed than they were. The revenue assumptions were built on an optimistic occupancy rate that required full dinner service seven nights a week from month 3 onward. There was no contingency column. The kitchen equipment line items were placeholder estimates copied from an online article. I recognized the source because I had bookmarked the same article when Iris had first mentioned the restaurant idea 2 years earlier. I told Preston the plan needed more work. I told him specifically what was missing. I was measured and respectful, and I offered to go through it line by line with him. He thanked me, smiled the salesman's smile, and told me he appreciated my input, but that his investors in the hospitality space had reviewed it and were satisfied. 3 weeks later he came back and asked me for $300,000. Iris was sitting beside him on my couch. She had her hands folded in her lap the way she used to as a child, when she was nervous, fingers laced together so tight her knuckles were pale. I said no. Preston nodded slowly, in that performative way that means someone is deciding how to categorize your refusal. Then he said he understood, and that he hoped I'd come around when I saw what they were building. Like my no was a temporary obstacle that would dissolve once I witnessed his success. What he did not know, what neither of them knew, was that I didn't say no because I couldn't help. I said no because I had already decided to help differently. I have a brother named Douglas. He's 2 years older than me and retired early after a career in commercial real estate. Douglas is the kind of man who has never in his life needed to raise his voice in a negotiation because the numbers do his talking. After my first conversation with Preston, I called Douglas and described what I'd seen. Douglas asked 2 questions. What does the daughter actually know about running a restaurant? And is the son-in-law teachable? I thought about it honestly. Iris had spent 8 years managing the kitchen operations for a hotel restaurant group before she quit to have Oliver. She knew the industry from the inside. She was the competent one. She was always the competent one. As for teachable, I told Douglas I wasn't sure Preston was the type of man who believed he had anything left to learn. Douglas was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's the answer to both questions." We made a plan. Douglas had a commercial property holding company he'd built up over 20 years, a portfolio of mixed-use real estate across the Pacific Northwest. Through that company, using a series of standard LLC structures, he purchased the building that Preston had already identified as his ideal restaurant location. Preston didn't know the ownership had changed. The listing had simply gone quiet, then reappeared under a property management company with a different name. That kind of thing happens in commercial real estate often enough that no one blinks. When Preston submitted his letter of intent for the lease, the property management firm responded with an offer. The terms were favorable, more favorable than market rate, because we set them that way. A 5-year lease with a first-year reduced rate and renewal options that locked in stable pricing. The kind of deal a new restaurant operator could actually survive on. Preston signed without negotiating. He called it a win and took Iris out to celebrate. The lease agreement had one clause buried in Section 11, subsection C, 2 pages before the signature line, in the same font as everything else. The reduced rate and all renewal options were contingent on the operating entity maintaining its current ownership structure. Any transfer of majority ownership interest required the landlord's written consent and a full financial review. Without that consent, the lease converted to standard market rate immediately. Preston never read past the summary page. I know this because when I asked him about the lease terms at a family dinner 2 months later, making conversation, he described the arrangement in a way that was missing several of its most important details. That was the first piece. The second piece took longer. About a year into the restaurant's operation, Preston approached me again. Not for investment this time. He wanted to know if I had any contacts in the city's permitting office. There was a patio expansion he needed approved, and the process had stalled. I did have contacts. 34 years with the State Transportation Department leaves you with a long list of people who know people. I told Preston I'd make some calls. What I did not tell him was that one of those calls was to a man named Leonard Chu, a former colleague who now ran a small consulting firm that specialized in small business compliance. I asked Leonard to do a quiet review of the restaurant's operating permits, business license, and health certifications as a favor to me. Leonard called me back 3 days later. The restaurant was operating under a business license that listed Preston as the sole owner. Iris's name appeared nowhere. Not as co-owner, not as partner, not even as a named operator. When they had set up this LLC, Preston had handled the filing, and Iris had signed where he told her to sign. Her ownership interest existed in a side agreement, a piece of paper Preston had drafted himself, and that had never been filed with anyone. It had no legal standing. I sat with that information for 2 days before I called Douglas. Douglas said, "How much of her own money has she put in?" I said I didn't know exactly. He said, "Find out." I had dinner with Iris the following week, just the two of us, at a Vietnamese place she liked near her house. I asked her carefully how things were going. She was tired, I could see it, but she talked about the restaurant the way she always talked about things she loved. With detail and precision. The problems she'd solved, the supplier she'd finally found for local mushrooms, the front-of-house manager she'd trained from scratch. I asked about the finances gently, just the big picture. She paused, looked down at her foe, and told me she had put in her savings, her full savings. The amount she had set aside since before she met Preston, the money she had been building since her 20s. I kept my face completely still. She said Preston was handling the investor side and she was focused on operations. She said it was going well. I paid for dinner and drove home and sat in my kitchen for a long time with the lights off. She had no legal ownership of the business she was running with her own money and her own expertise, and she didn't know it. Everything I had built for Iris over the years, the college fund that had graduated her debt-free, the down payment I had quietly contributed toward the house she and Preston lived in, channeled through Douglas's company at a below-market mortgage rate. The car she drove that was financed through one of Douglas's holding entities because Preston's credit had been too thin to get a reasonable rate. None of it was registered in her name in any way that Preston could reach. I had never told her any of it. I had told myself it was because I didn't want her to feel indebted to me. That was true. But sitting in that dark kitchen, I admitted to myself that there was another reason. I had known for a long time that something was wrong in the architecture of her life, and I had kept building quietly underneath it, holding up floors that shouldn't have needed holding. The night after Thanksgiving, I called Douglas and said one word. He knew what it meant. We had talked about the possibility, in the abstract, the way you talk about contingency plans you hope you never use. He didn't say he was sorry to hear it. He just said, "When do you want to start?" I said Monday. I want to be careful here about what happened next, because it would be easy to describe it as revenge, and that's not what it was. I want you to understand that, because the distinction matters to everything that follows. When I drove home from Thanksgiving with the rain coming down and the highway empty, I was not thinking about Preston. I was thinking about Oliver, looking up from the next room with those eyes that were still young enough to believe that adults make sense. I was thinking about my daughter's hands on her lap, knuckles pale, looking at her plate. I had been patient. I had been generous. I had been quietly, invisibly generous for years, and my patience had not protected anyone. It had simply bought time for the problem to grow larger. An engineer doesn't demolish a failing structure out of anger. He does it because the structure is no longer doing what it was built to do, and leaving it standing has become more dangerous than taking it down. The first move was the lease. Douglas's property management company notified the restaurant that the annual compliance review, a standard provision in Section 8 of the lease that Preston had also apparently not read, required a current copy of the business's operating license and proof of liability insurance renewal. Standard procedure, the letter said. 45 days to comply or the lease terms would revert to standard market rate pending a full renegotiation. Preston sent the documents without concern. The operating license confirmed what Leonard had already told me. Iris's name was absent. The business was structured in a way that left her exposed. Douglas's attorneys prepared a notice, not aggressive, purely procedural, flagging that the operating entity's ownership structure appeared to have changed from its original representation, and requesting a meeting to review the lease terms under Section 11, subsection C. Preston called Douglas's property manager in a panic. The property manager, a calm woman named, and I always appreciate professionals who can stay calm, simply told him that this was a standard compliance issue and suggested he speak with his attorney before the meeting. Preston did not have a retained attorney. He had used an online document service for all of his business filings. He called Iris. I don't know exactly what she said to him. I know that 2 days later she called me. She asked if I knew anything about the property management company that held their lease. Her voice was careful, measuring. I said I might know something about the building. I said I thought it was time we talked. She came to my house that evening. She sat in the same chair she'd sat in as a teenager, the wingback chair by the fireplace that she'd always claimed when she came home. She was wearing the coat she'd bought herself after her first real management job, a dark green wool coat she'd never let me help pay for. I had always loved that about her. I told her everything. I started with the lease in the building. I showed her the ownership documents. I watched her face move through something I can only describe as a quiet kind of earthquake. Not the dramatic collapse, but the kind where the ground just shifts incrementally under your feet until you realize the landscape you thought you were standing on no longer exists. I told her about the mortgage, about the car financing, about the LLC structures Douglas had used so that every asset connected to her life was insulated from the business entity Preston controlled. She was very still for a long time. Then she said, "Did you know about my ownership interest, the filing?" I told her I had learned about it recently. I told her I had not done anything with that information yet because I wanted her to be the one to decide what to do with it. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Show me everything." We sat at my kitchen table until 11 o'clock at night. I showed her every document. Douglas joined on a video call from his house in Bend and walked her through the structures he had built and what they meant and what they protected. By the end of it, Iris had legal confirmation that Preston's business entity had no claim on the building it operated in, no path to the financing that had made the house possible, no access to any of the assets I had put in her name or in Douglas's protective structures over the years. She also had clarity for the first time about her own position inside the restaurant's ownership structure, or rather the absence of one. She didn't cry. Iris has always been more like me in that way. She processes sideways, quietly, in the middle of doing something else. She asked me what I thought she should do. I told her that wasn't my decision. I told her I had built walls because I had been afraid for her and I hadn't been honest about that, and I was sorry for it. I told her that whatever she decided, the structures Douglas had built would hold, and that her savings were hers, and that her expertise was hers, and that those were the things that actually built a business. She nodded, slowly. She said, "The mushroom supplier is on my personal email." I almost smiled. I said I figured as much. What happened in the weeks after that, I learned in pieces, the way you learn about earthquakes, from the aftershocks. Preston received a formal letter from Douglas's attorneys informing him that the lease renegotiation meeting had been scheduled, and that the property's ownership required full documentation of the business entity's operating structure before any renewal terms could be discussed. The letter was written in the kind of legal language that sounds like courtesy and means business. He also received separately a notice from the financing company that held the car loan, another of Douglas's entities, that the account had been flagged for review following an unrelated portfolio audit, and that they would be in contact. The letter was technically accurate. Everything in it was true. Timing is not deception, Preston called me. I want to be honest about this part because it was not the conversation I had imagined in 100 different versions over several years. His voice was not the salesman's voice. It was smaller, younger. He said he didn't understand what was happening. He said he felt like the walls were closing in from every direction, and he couldn't figure out why. I told him to come to my house. He drove over the next morning. He sat in the wingback chair which Iris had vacated the night before, and I sat across from him and folded my hands the way I do when I'm about to explain something structural to someone who has never thought about structure before. I didn't raise my voice. I never needed to. I told him about the building. I pulled up Douglas's ownership documents and turned the laptop to face him. I watched him look at my brother's name on the deed of the building his restaurant occupied, and work backward toward the realization about how long that had been true. I told him about the financing structures, about the mortgage, about the car. Then I told him what I had learned about the business license and Iris's absent legal standing in the company. She had funded with her own savings and operated with her own knowledge. He started to say something about intentions, about how it had been a clerical issue, about how he had meant to fix it. I let him say it. Then I said, Preston, I want you to understand something. I have been to City Hall for permits that required more documentation than you put into the legal structure of a business where my daughter invested her life savings. What you're describing as a clerical error is a situation where the woman who trained your staff, built your supplier relationships, and runs your kitchen every day has no legal claim to the business she is keeping alive. He was quiet for a long time. I said, I'm not here to destroy anything. I'm an engineer. I'm here because the structure you built cannot hold the weight it's carrying. And I would rather help you fix it than watch it fall on my daughter. And then I said the thing I had been thinking since the drive home in the rain, since the ceramic fish tiles, since 34 years of building things designed to last. But nothing gets fixed until Iris is a named partner with legal ownership, on file in writing, with an attorney of her choosing. Not yours, hers, and not tomorrow this week. He nodded. He looked like a man who had spent a long time performing the role of someone who knew what he was doing, and had only just realized, sitting in a wingback chair in his father-in-law's living room, that the performance was over. It took 11 days. Iris found an attorney through her hotel management contacts, a woman she trusted who specialized in small business partnerships. The ownership structure was refiled. Iris's name went on the operating license. Her savings contribution was formalized as an equity stake that made her the majority partner. Preston signed everything. I don't think he had much of a choice. But I also think, sitting in that chair, something had shifted for him. I'm not optimistic enough to call it growth. But I think he understood, for the first time, that the floor he was standing on had been built by someone else, and that person was still in the room. The lease was renewed. The rent stayed at the original rate. The car financing review was quietly resolved. The portfolio audit had found no issues. These things happen. A few weeks later, Iris called me on a Sunday morning. She said the restaurant had its best October since opening. She said Oliver had started asking questions about what a civil engineer actually does. I said I'd be happy to explain it to him sometime. She said, Dad, he wants to see a bridge. I told her I knew just the one. I thought about calling Preston that evening and didn't. There was nothing left to say between us that the documents hadn't already said more clearly. Some conversations finished themselves. What I know now, sitting on my back porch with the rain tapping the overhang the way it always does in November in Portland, is something I should have understood earlier. Silence is not the same as protection. I spent years building invisible supports under a structure that was developing cracks I could see and didn't say anything about because I didn't want to be the reason it fell. The hardest thing an engineer learns is that a load-bearing wall doesn't announce itself. It just holds, until it doesn't. I was the wall, and I had been holding up the wrong things. There's something I want to ask you before we go, because I've been thinking about it since that Thanksgiving table. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who didn't know what they were standing on, I want to hear about it. Comment 1 if you think I should have stepped in sooner, that the quiet approach cost too much time. Comment 2 if you think what I did was right, that some people only understand the language of consequences. Or comment 3 if you think Preston deserved a harsher lesson, and that I let him off too easy. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I've started to notice that the people who respond to stories like this one are up at strange hours, which tells me something about what these stories mean to the people who find them. If you've ever been the quiet one in a room full of noise, you already know how this ends. The noise eventually stops. The structure either holds or it doesn't. And the person who built it is still there either way, long after everyone else has forgotten they were in the room at all.